Title: The Unseen Visitor. Chapter 1. The Unseen Visitor. The house was always cold. Not the kind of cold that can be chased away by a fire or thick blankets, but a deep, unrelenting chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the walls. It was a feeling that clung to everything, to the floorboards, to the air, and to the heavy curtains that hung in the windows, always drawn tight, keeping the light from creeping in. I had grown accustomed to the cold, as one does with something inevitable, something that had always been there, just under the surface, waiting. But in the nights that followed my arrival in Ravensbrück, that cold took on a different meaning. It became suffocating, and no matter how many layers I piled on, or how tightly I curled into the bed, it never left. I had moved here to escape, to run from a life that had become too heavy to bear. The death of my wife, Emma, had left me hollow, and I had thought that perhaps a change of scenery, a quiet, forgotten town far from the memories of my past life, would ease the weight of the grief. But the moment I stepped off the bus and into Ravensbrück, I felt it. Something wrong in the air. Something that didn't belong. Something that had been here long before I arrived. The house itself was an old Victorian manor on the outskirts of town, shrouded in the kind of silence that makes you nervous. It had been abandoned for years, a relic of the past that no one wanted to touch. The realtor had been eager to get rid of it, and the price had been a fraction of what a house in a more populated area would have cost. Too good to be true, I thought. But I was desperate. It seemed perfect. A place I could disappear into. A place where no one would ask questions. Where I could just fade away into the shadows. The first night I spent there, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the discomfort of the bed or the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, but because of something more subtle. Something unsettling. I could feel eyes on me, though there was no one there. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move with an almost imperceptible life of their own, curling and twisting like smoke, never quite settling. The walls creaked with every gust of wind that rattled the old windows, and the house groaned under the weight of its years. But I told myself it was just my mind, playing tricks. I had been through a lot. The trauma of Emma's sudden death, the accident that had torn our world apart, it was enough to make anyone imagine ghosts in the corners of their vision. The grief, the loss, it makes everything feel like it's made of glass, so delicate, ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the old house, the unfamiliar sounds of a building that had stood untouched for decades. But the next morning when I went to make coffee, I noticed something odd. The kitchen window, which I had left locked the night before, was open. The latch had been undone, the window wide, allowing the cool morning air to flood the room. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. Had I left it open? I couldn't remember. I must have. There was no other explanation, but the feeling of being watched returned, like I was being observed from behind that window, from the trees outside. I closed the window and locked it, trying to push the unease away. But it followed me through the day, lingering like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. It was the small things, the subtle disturbances, the lights flickering, the door slamming shut when no wind was blowing, the feeling that the house was breathing. By the third night, I was certain I wasn't alone. The scratching had begun. At first, I thought it was the house settling, some small creature running across the rafters, but the sound was too deliberate, too slow. The sound of something moving, methodically, as if it were waiting, watching. It started at the ceiling, scratching, tapping, dragging across the surface like nails on wood. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the old timbers, the house settling, but the sound persisted, growing louder as if the thing above me knew I was listening. And then, it spoke. The voice came from the darkness, soft and low, just a whisper, but enough to freeze the blood in my veins. "Leave," it said, the word drawn out like a sigh. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I had never heard a voice like that before, thin, strained, as though it had been there for ages, waiting to be heard. I turned slowly, scanning the room, my eyes jumping from one shadow to another. But there was nothing but the stillness, the suffocating silence of the house. I stood up, trembling, and walked to the door, my hand shaking as I gripped the knob. The air in the hallway was thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I stepped into the hall, my feet moving soundlessly over the worn carpet, my heart thudding in my chest. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the small windows. The walls seemed to close in around me, their shadows stretching like arms, trying to pull me into them. I walked slowly, deliberately toward the stairs that led to the attic. There had always been something about that attic that unsettled me. It was sealed off, hidden away behind a thick door that seemed too heavy for the house to bear. The door was locked, but the key had been left on the mantel when I arrived. It had felt like an invitation, a welcome gift, an unspoken invitation to explore. I stopped in front of the door, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the key in my pocket. The scratching, the whispering, they both seemed to come from there, from behind that door, from the attic. The old house was calling to me. With a steady hand, I inserted the key and turned the lock. The door opened with a groan, the hinges protesting against the weight of time. The stairs leading up to the attic were narrow and steep, their wooden steps worn and uneven. I could feel the cold air rising from above, thick with the smell of dust and something else, something musty, like decay. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, the silence growing thicker with each ascent. As I reached the top, I paused at the threshold of the attic. The door was ajar, just slightly, and through the crack, I could see nothing but blackness. The smell was stronger now, an almost metallic tang that made my stomach turn. I pushed the door open fully, the hinges screeching in protest. The attic was small, filled with boxes and furniture covered in old yellowed sheets. Dust motes swirled in the faint light that filtered in from the single small window, casting everything in a ghostly glow. But it was the mirror that caught my eye. At the far end of the room, partially obscured by a pile of boxes, stood an old full-length mirror. Its frame was ornate, carved from dark wood, and covered in a thin layer of dust. But it wasn't the mirror itself that disturbed me. It was what was reflected in it. The room behind me was not the same. The angles were wrong. The shadows stretched too far. The furniture appeared out of place. It was as though the mirror reflected another version of the room, a distorted, decayed version of reality. But the worst part was the figure standing in the reflection. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw the movement. The figure in the mirror wasn't still. It was a woman, her back turned toward me, her hair hanging in matted strands. She stood perfectly still, and yet the reflection seemed to shift, to twitch, as if she were alive. I turned quickly, my heart racing, but there was nothing behind me. The attic was empty. I spun back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. Only the empty attic stared back at me, the dust and shadows once again silent. But then, through the silence, came the whisper again. "Leave now!" The voice was close, too close. I turned and fled, my pulse pounding in my ears, my legs moving without thought, carrying me away from the attic, away from the mirror, away from the darkness that had followed me into this house. But the shadows were waiting. Pam, Chapter 1. The unseen visitor builds the tension, setting the stage for a deep psychological unraveling. The protagonist's isolation and grief are interwoven with the haunting presence that stalks the house, creating an atmosphere thick with fear. The tension escalates as the paranormal events become more intense, and the sense of an invisible force guiding the protagonist toward an inevitable confrontation grows. Let me know if you want me to continue further or elaborate on any specific details. Chapter 2. Beneath the Surface. The days that followed were a blur, strung together by a thread of restless nights and fleeting moments of daylight that felt just as suffocating as the darkness. Ravensbrück, the town that had once seemed like a refuge, a quiet place where I could recover from the tragedy that had shattered my life, now felt like a trap. Every corner I turned, every quiet street I walked down, the weight of the place pressed harder against my chest. The town was alive, in a way that I had never experienced before. The trees, the houses, even the air itself seemed to hold a secret, a darkness that hummed beneath the surface, waiting to break free. At first, I tried to tell myself it was the stress of the move, the grief that still clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I tried to convince myself that the house was simply old, creaking under the weight of time. But no amount of rationalization could explain the coldness in the walls, the way the shadows stretched unnaturally in the corners of each room, as if they were reaching out to touch me. The feeling of being watched had only intensified since the night I ventured into the attic, and I couldn't escape it, not even during the day. It started again the next night. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows like the fingers of something trying to claw its way inside. I had been sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the old fireplace, the flames dancing lazily but failing to warm me. My mind had been drifting, caught in the tangled mess of thoughts and memories that seemed to come and go in waves. Then, the sound returned. At first, it was just a faint scratching, a light tapping against the walls, barely perceptible over the sound of the wind. But soon it grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. The sound came from behind the walls, as if something was moving just out of sight. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my back, my palms growing clammy as the noise continued, persistent, unrelenting. I stood up, my legs shaky, and slowly approached the wall. The house groaned in protest beneath my weight as I stepped across the creaking floorboards. The noise, the scratching, had stopped, but I could feel it. Feel the presence on the other side of the wall, just out of reach, as though it were waiting for me to make a move. The room was so quiet now that I could hear my breath in the stillness. It felt suffocating. I reached out to touch the wall and my hand froze inches from the surface. The temperature had dropped, so suddenly that it was as though the very air had frozen solid. My breath came in visible puffs, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up, prickling with the awareness that something was very wrong. I pulled my hand back, swallowing the lump in my throat, and backed away from the wall. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could feel the familiar sensation, the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was in the house with me, something that had been there far longer than I had. The wind outside howled again, and I snapped my head toward the window, but it wasn't the wind that caught my attention. No, it was the reflection in the glass. At first, I didn't recognize it. The figure was too distorted, too out of place. It was as though something was standing just behind me, out of my line of sight, but reflected perfectly in the glass. I spun around quickly, my breath hitching, but there was nothing, only the empty shadowed room behind me. The reflection, however, remained. The same figure, a tall, gaunt shape, standing in the same spot, its face obscured by the darkness. I felt my stomach twist as the figure moved. It didn't step forward. It didn't walk. It simply shifted. The way it tilted its head was wrong, too slow, too deliberate, as though it were studying me, waiting for me to make a mistake. A sound escaped my throat, a low, involuntary gasp. But the figure didn't move. It simply stared back at me, its form flickering at the edges, the shadows around it swallowing its features like they didn't belong in the room. Without thinking, I stumbled back, my feet tripping over the edge of the carpet, my heart racing in my chest. I turned to run, but before I could take another step, the air grew impossibly thick. It felt like the very walls of the room were closing in around me, pressing against my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I gasped for air, my vision swimming, the room spinning as if the very fabric of reality was warping. My legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I reached for something, anything stable. The scratching began again. It was no longer coming from the walls. It was coming from the floor, beneath me. I pressed my ear to the cold floorboards, trying to make sense of it, but the sound only grew louder, more frantic. It was like something was underneath me, trying to break through, trying to claw its way to the surface. My pulse quickened, each thundering beat amplifying the madness in my head. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, trapped, like I was sinking into the earth itself. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood, of mildew, and something else, something rancid, like decay. I scrambled to my feet, gasping, as the shadows in the room began to move. They stretched and warped, distorting the walls, twisting the furniture until the room was unrecognizable, consumed by darkness. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor, and through the half-light I saw it. A figure, that same figure, was standing in the doorway. The woman, her face hidden beneath a dark veil of hair, her arms outstretched as if to welcome me. Her hands were too long, her fingers too thin, curling in on themselves like the roots of an ancient tree. Her eyes, though obscured, seemed to glow with an unnatural light, burning through the veil of darkness. And the whispers, they grew louder. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was a rasp, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. It echoed in my mind, reverberating through my skull. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw her smile. Or was it a grimace? I turned and ran. The door slammed shut behind me as I burst into the hallway, my chest tight with fear, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house seemed to be shifting around me, bending, stretching. The walls twisted as though they were alive, breathing, and every step I took seemed to bring me closer to the thing that had been waiting in the dark. I made it to the front door, my hand reaching out for the knob, but when I turned it, it wouldn't budge. I pushed harder, panicked, but the door wouldn't open. I could hear the whispers now, louder than ever, filling the air around me like a suffocating fog. My fingers were numb as I fumbled with the lock, my mind clouded with a growing sense of dread that I couldn't escape. I turned around to face the hallway, only to see the woman standing at the far end, her outstretched hand reaching for me, her eyes glowing with an unsettling light. "You cannot leave." The voice was not just in my ears, it was inside my mind, pressing against my skull. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. But the whispers grew louder, insistent, and with a final, desperate push, I shoved the door open, crashing into the cold night air. I ran. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, not looking back. The town of Ravensbrück, with its crooked streets and suffocating shadows, faded behind me. But the sensation, the feeling of being followed, never left. And I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that whatever had been waiting in that house, whatever had been whispering in the darkness, wasn't done with me yet. It was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Beneath the surface further builds the sense of paranoia and terror that the protagonist faces in the haunted house. The oppressive atmosphere intensifies as they come face to face with the supernatural forces that are controlling the space around them. The psychological horror deepens, and the protagonist begins to realize that escaping the house will not be so simple. Let me know if you'd like me to expand on any specific aspect. Chapter 3. The whispers in the walls. The days after I ran from the house felt like a blur, a thick fog that clouded my every thought. I had left Ravensbrück in a rush, without a plan, without any intention of coming back. But it didn't matter. The nightmare wasn't bound by distance. It followed me. I thought that by leaving, by putting miles between me and the house, I could escape whatever malevolent force had taken root there. But the whispering never stopped. It never faded. The sound followed me, echoing in the recesses of my mind, tugging at the edges of my consciousness like a thread unraveling in the dark. And the visions, those fleeting moments when I thought I saw her, the woman with the veil of hair, her outstretched hands, those images lingered like ghosts, haunting my every waking moment. I stayed with a friend for a few days, desperate for normalcy, desperate for anything that could distract me from the gnawing dread that clawed at my insides. But the peace I sought eluded me. The whispers grew louder at night, no longer just a faint echo, but an insistent voice that seemed to call my name, tugging at me, pulling me back to Ravensbrück, back to the house that refused to let me go. I could feel it, the pull, the magnetic force that seemed to draw me back like a moth to a flame. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that it was just the trauma, the grief, that the stress of everything I had been through was playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew it was something more. I had felt it. The presence. The thing that had been waiting in the dark corners of the house. The thing that had spoken to me in whispers and shadows. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. And so, I found myself back on the road, heading back toward Ravensbrück, toward that damn house. I had no choice. I had to face it. I had to confront whatever was waiting for me there. The drive felt longer than it should have. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, that every turn I took was leading me deeper into a trap, that no matter how far I went, I was always going to end up back where it all began. The sun was setting as I reached the outskirts of Ravensbrook, the golden light fading behind the hills, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. It looked so peaceful, so normal, yet I knew better. I knew the darkness that lived here, that thrived in the silence. When I arrived at the house, the first thing that struck me was the silence. The same oppressive silence that had haunted me the first night I stayed there. The same eerie stillness that seemed to cling to the air, suffocating, waiting for something to break it. The house stood in front of me, looming against the twilight sky, its windows like empty eyes watching, waiting. I felt the chill in the air, the same chill that had greeted me on the night I first moved in, and the same sense of dread that had never left me. I stepped out of the car, my feet unsteady on the gravel, my mind clouded with fear and confusion. My hands shook as I reached for the door, the metal handle cold beneath my fingers, and the moment I stepped inside, the house seemed to breathe around me. It groaned and creaked, the very foundation seeming to shift beneath my feet, as if the house had been waiting for me, anticipating my return. The air inside was heavy with the scent of mildew and dust, the remnants of neglect and abandonment that had seeped into the walls, the floors, and the air itself. The house had not changed. It was as I had left it, with the same peeling wallpaper and faded furniture, the same worn carpet and cracked floors. Yet, it felt different now. The shadows were deeper, more sinister, as though they were alive, moving with a will of their own. I forced myself to take a step forward, my breath shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the house watching me, waiting for me to move further inside, to come closer to whatever it was that lingered in the darkness. The scratching started again. It was faint at first, just a soft tapping, almost like the sound of fingernails tapping against the wall. But as I walked through the hallway, the sound grew louder, more deliberate, like something was digging its way through the walls, trying to get to me. My heart raced, and I found myself backing up, my mind screaming at me to leave, to turn around and never come back. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, my legs refusing to obey, my feet stuck in place as the sound grew louder and closer. "You can't leave," the voice whispered, so close it was as though the words were inside my head, echoing in my skull. "You never will." I felt the weight of the words as they pressed down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. I spun around, my eyes searching the room for any sign of movement, for any shape that wasn't just a shadow. But there was nothing, just the same empty hallway, the same dark corners that had been there since the moment I first set foot in the house. Yet the darkness felt alive now, as though it had taken form, as if the shadows were no longer simply shadows but something more. I needed to find it. I needed to know what was behind the whispers, behind the scratching, behind the feeling of being watched. I made my way back toward the attic door, the same door that had felt so heavy the first time I opened it. The same door that had led me to the mirror, to the figure, to the woman who had spoken to me. My hands trembled as I reached for the key, but when I touched it, the metal was warm. Too warm. I felt it then, the presence. It wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was in the air, in the very room, suffocating me. The house was alive with it. The key turned easily in the lock, and as the door creaked open, a wave of cold air rushed out, as if something deep inside had been waiting to be released. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The attic was darker than I remembered, the shadows so deep that I could barely see my hand in front of my face. The air was thick with dust, but there was something else, something foul, the scent of rot, of decay, of something long dead. I felt it then, crawling along my skin, a presence, an awareness that wasn't my own. It was watching me, waiting for me to do something, to make a move. I moved toward the far corner of the room, where the mirror still stood, the same mirror that had reflected the woman, the same one that had shown me the twisted version of the room. But this time, when I approached the mirror, there was no reflection. The glass was empty. My heart sank as I reached out to touch the surface. It was cold, colder than the air around me, as though the mirror itself had been frozen. I pressed my hand against the glass, and the moment my fingers touched it, the world around me seemed to shudder. The whispers returned. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was stronger now, more insistent, filling the room with a deafening sound, as if the walls were closing in. The glass of the mirror rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. And then, the reflection changed. It was no longer the empty attic. The reflection was a room that didn't exist in the house. A room filled with shadows and the faintest outline of something moving. A figure that was too tall, too twisted to be real. I saw the woman again, her long, clawed fingers reaching out from the reflection, her hollow eyes fixed on mine. "You belong here," the voice whispered, now too close to my ear, too loud in my mind. "You're part of us. You always have been." I tried to pull away, but the mirror's surface seemed to pull me in. The edges of my vision blurred, and I felt myself being drawn toward it, toward the thing on the other side, toward the darkness that had always been here, always waiting. With a force I didn't know I had, I stumbled backward, breaking contact with the mirror. The room snapped back into focus, the air suddenly warmer, but the whispers remained. They were in my head, in my soul, burrowing deeper with each passing second. I had to leave, but as I turned to flee, the door slammed shut behind me. Chapter 3. The Whispers in the Walls delves deeper into the protagonist's unraveling, both mentally and emotionally, as they begin to confront the horrifying supernatural forces in the house. The scratching, the whispering, and the mirrors all come together, revealing that something far darker and more powerful is at play. The psychological terror builds as the protagonist realizes that they cannot escape the house, nor the malevolent presence that dwells within it. Let me know if you'd like further elaboration on any part of the chapter or further details. Chapter 4. The Thing in the Walls. The house had become a prison. I had once thought that the worst of it was over, that after the mirror in the attic, after the whispers and the scratching, the house would finally release its grip on me. But I was wrong. I had underestimated it, underestimated the sheer power of whatever dark force had taken root here. The house was not a place that would allow itself to be abandoned. It was alive, or rather, it fed. On fear, on grief, on despair. It clung to me now, like a thick fog that would not dissipate, and I could feel it growing stronger, its presence swelling in the very walls, in the floorboards, in the very air I breathed. It started with the voices. At first, they were faint whispers, just beyond the threshold of hearing, like the sound of wind rustling through dead leaves. But over time, the voices grew louder, more insistent, until they became a constant hum, a buzz, like the sound of 1,000 flies swarming around my head. It wasn't just in the house either. The voices followed me wherever I went. I could hear them in the streets of Ravensbrook, in the wind as it howled through the trees, in the soft rustling of paper and the creak of furniture. The voices had become a part of me, tangled in my thoughts, drowning out everything else. I tried to drown them out by staying busy. I cleaned the house, rearranged the furniture, did everything I could to keep my mind occupied. But the house resisted. The dust would never settle. The floorboards would never creak in the right places. The shadows in the corners never stayed in the corners. They crept closer, closer, until they were at my back, whispering to me in the darkness. And then, the thing in the walls began to speak. It started small, almost imperceptible, just a slight creaking, a tap, a shift in the air, but soon it was louder, more deliberate, as if something was scraping against the walls, pushing against the plaster, trying to get out. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just the house settling, just the wind pushing against the old structure, but deep down I knew it was something more. I could feel it. It wasn't just the walls. It was inside the walls. The sound wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from within, from the very core of the house itself. I could feel the vibration of it in my bones, like the hum of a deep, resonating frequency that made my teeth ache and my skin crawl. The scratching came again that night. I had been sitting in the living room, the fire burning low in the hearth, the warmth of the flames doing little to calm the growing unease in my chest. I was trying to read, trying to distract myself from the whispers that had started again. But the more I tried to ignore them, the louder they became. They were no longer whispers, not just faint voices. They had shape, they had form. They were becoming real, and I could no longer pretend that they were not. I set the book down and stood, my hands trembling as I walked to the window. The moon hung heavy in the sky, its pale light casting long, stretching shadows across the street. The town of Ravensbrück looked peaceful, almost idyllic in the quiet of the night. But I knew better. The peaceful exterior was a mask, and beneath it, the dark heart of the town beat with a rhythm I had come to know all too well. It pulsed with the same rhythm that throbbed in my head, in my chest, the whispering, the scratching. It was all connected. I turned back to the room, but something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. The hallway to the attic door. The shadows were different now, darker, deeper. The shadows were shifting, moving in unnatural ways, like something was crawling through them, something that was too large to be contained in the small space of the hallway. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I felt my body go rigid, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows in the hallway stretched, elongated, reaching for me as though they had a mind of their own. My body moved before I could stop it, my feet carrying me toward the door. I reached for the handle. The door was cold to the touch, its iron hinges groaning in protest as I opened it. A wave of stale, damp air hit me, the scent of mildew and decay flooding my senses. But beneath it, there was something else, a rancid, almost metallic tang, like blood, like rust. The air in the hallway felt wrong, as though the very walls were closing in around me. I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The house felt alive in a way that I could no longer ignore. It was breathing, it was moving, and it was waiting for me to make the next move. The scratching grew louder. It came from the wall behind me, from the room that I had just left, from the place I had been sitting only moments before. It was no longer a faint, distant noise. It was here. It was in the house with me, trying to get through the walls, trying to break through to the other side. The sound of nails scraping against wood, the sound of something clawing its way out, filled my ears. I spun around, my eyes searching the darkness for the source of the noise, but there was nothing there, just the darkness, the suffocating, oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse, to breathe. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I had to see it. I stepped toward the wall, my hand trembling as I placed it against the cold, rough surface. The house seemed to shudder beneath my touch, as if it were alive, as if it recognized me. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. Something was there, watching me, waiting for me to turn around. The scratching stopped. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. The air was thick with silence now, a suffocating, oppressive quiet that pressed against my ears. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, its shape impossibly thin, its limbs stretched too long, too twisted. The face was hidden, obscured by hair, but I could feel its eyes, its gaze piercing through the darkness, boring into me. It was standing perfectly still, not moving, but watching, waiting. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, its footfall too soft to hear but too heavy to ignore. It moved with an unnatural grace, like something that was not meant to exist in this world, something that had been torn from the fabric of reality itself. The shadows around it seemed to bend, to ripple, as though they were made of liquid. The air grew colder, and I felt my skin break out in goosebumps, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I couldn't look away, and then, in a voice that seemed to come from the depths of my own mind, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The words were cold, hollow, and filled with an emptiness that made my blood run cold. I took a step back, but the floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the figure's eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, never left me. I turned and ran. I ran down the hallway, my legs moving faster than they ever had, my feet slipping on the polished floorboards as I fled from the thing that had been waiting in the darkness. The house seemed to shift around me, the walls narrowing, the shadows growing longer, reaching out to grab me. I reached the stairs, but when I looked back, I saw the figure standing at the top, its hand reaching toward me, its fingers twisted and elongated. I screamed, my voice breaking through the silence, but it did nothing. The figure was coming closer. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its voice echoing through the house. "You are already part of it." For Chapter 4, The Thing in the Walls delves deeper into the terror of the house, as the protagonist is drawn into the nightmare of their own mind and the supernatural forces that have been watching them. The tension escalates as the house becomes more oppressive, the figure in the hallway more terrifying, and the true nature of the house's curse becomes clearer. The psychological horror intensifies, and the protagonist begins to understand that there is no escape from the malevolent presence that haunts them. Let me know if you'd like to expand further on any particular aspect, or if you have specific details you'd like to explore. Chapter 5. The Echoes of the Past. The house had swallowed me whole. Every corner, every hallway, every room in that cursed place seemed to stretch and twist, pulling me deeper into its dark embrace. The walls were alive with whispers, the floorboards groaning underfoot as though they were trying to speak to me, to tell me something I couldn't quite understand. The air was thick with a kind of oppression, a heaviness that weighed on my chest, forcing the air from my lungs. It wasn't just the house. No, it was something more, something ancient, something that had lived there long before I had set foot in this place. I had tried to leave. I had run, hadn't I? I had driven through the town of Ravensbrück in a blind panic, desperate to escape the nightmare that had followed me home. But no matter how far I went, no matter how many miles I put between myself and the house, I couldn't outrun it. It was in my thoughts, in my dreams, in the very air that I breathed. And then, after days of trying to ignore the pull, the whispering, the scratching at the edges of my sanity, I had returned. Something, some compulsion, some force greater than my will, had drawn me back, and now I was standing at the threshold of it again. The house greeted me with silence. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the kind of silence that comes just before something terrible happens. The kind of silence where every creak of the floor, every gust of wind, every movement of shadow feels like an intrusion. Like the house itself is watching, waiting. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. A coldness seeped into my bones, a biting chill that crawled under my skin, spreading like ice through my veins. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood, old mildew, and something else, something foul that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the house alone. It was the weight of its history, the residue of the things that had happened here, things I was only beginning to understand. The house had been silent for so long, but I could feel it waking, stretching, feeling me out like a predator sensing its prey. I walked down the narrow hallway, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the stillness, my mind racing with questions I didn't have the answers to. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows in the corners growing darker, deeper, as though they were pulling at the edges of the room. I could feel them. I could feel the presence in the house, watching me, listening. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The voices had returned. At first it was nothing more than a hum, a low murmur that seemed to come from the walls, the floor, the very foundation of the house. But the longer I stood there, the more the sound became clear. Voices, overlapping, rising in a crescendo of whispers. So many voices, so many people speaking at once. The words were indistinct, like fragments of a conversation I couldn't quite make out. But there was one thing I was sure of. They were speaking to me. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was clearer now, and it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a cold, harsh whisper, like someone breathing ice down my neck. I froze in place, my body rigid with fear, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls felt closer, pressing in on me, suffocating me. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move, something that wasn't there before. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway. It was tall, its limbs stretched too long, too thin, its body impossibly gaunt, as though it had been pulled from the shadows themselves. Its face, if it could be called a face, was obscured by dark, matted hair, its features barely discernible, but its eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, glowed with a pale light. I could feel its gaze on me, cutting through the darkness like a blade. I tried to speak, but my throat constricted. My words caught in my mouth. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness of the house, my mind screaming for release, for escape. But the house was shifting. It was alive, and it was trapping me in its grasp. I reached the door to the kitchen, but before I could turn the handle, I heard it. The sound of scraping again, louder this time. It was coming from behind me, from the walls, from the very floor beneath my feet. It was closer now, the sound of claws scraping against wood, against stone. I spun around, my eyes scanning the hallway for the source, but there was nothing, only darkness, thick and suffocating. And then I saw it. The shadow in the corner of the hallway, a dark shape that seemed to pulse with life, as if it were breathing, moving with purpose. The figure was there again, standing at the far end of the hall, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its gaze fixed on me, burning through the shadows. It spoke again. "You can't escape." The voice was louder this time, clearer, and the words echoed in my mind, as if the house itself was speaking, as if the walls were alive with the breath of the thing that had been waiting here for so long. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot as the figure in the hallway began to move toward me. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped forward, its limbs contorting unnaturally, its body twisting with an impossible grace, like something that didn't belong in this world. Something that had no place here. It wasn't human. I could feel the darkness closing in, smothering me, and the house itself was laughing. The walls groaned, the air thick with a cold that sank deep into my bones. The shadows flickered, twisting, as though they were alive, their shapes warping and stretching in ways that defied reality. And the figure kept moving, closer, closer still, until I could feel its presence, pressing against me like a weight, a burden too heavy to bear. "You are part of me," the voice said again, the words like a command, a promise, a curse. "You cannot leave." I screamed, but it was a hollow sound, swallowed by the walls, drowned in the suffocating air. My body moved then, not of its own accord, but by some primal instinct, and I ran as fast as I could, my legs carrying me toward the door, toward the exit, but the door didn't open. The handle twisted beneath my fingers, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the door was locked. It wouldn't open. The house wouldn't let me leave. The shadow was upon me then, its hand reaching out to touch me, its fingers impossibly long, curling around my wrist, tightening like iron. The darkness consumed me, the figure's face coming closer, the hollow eyes staring into mine, into my very soul. "You belong here." The whisper was inside my head, louder now, as though the house itself was speaking through the figure, through the shadows, through the walls. The words filled my mind, suffocating me, drowning me in the promise of something ancient, something evil that had been waiting here for as long as the house had stood. I tried to pull away, but the figure's grip tightened, its fingers sinking into my skin, its touch freezing, like ice. And then, in that moment, I saw it, the thing that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. A door, a hidden door just beyond the wall, hidden behind a tapestry that hung so quietly I hadn't noticed it before. I struggled, my legs shaking, but I couldn't stop. I ran toward it, desperate for any escape, for any way out of the house, but the shadows followed me. The walls closed in. I reached the door. The handle was cold, slick with something that wasn't water, wasn't sweat. My fingers brushed the surface of the door, and the sound stopped. The whispers died. The scratching ceased. The house was holding its breath. I turned the handle. The door opened. Chapter 5. The Echoes of the Past further explores the deepening psychological terror the protagonist experiences as they begin to uncover the horrifying truth about the house. The walls themselves seem to come alive, the entity that inhabits it more aggressive and malevolent than before. The protagonist is trapped, unable to escape, and is forced to confront the thing that has been waiting for them all along. The chapter delves into the mystery of the house's past and the supernatural forces that control it. Let me know if you want to explore any specific aspects of the story or further develop the plot. Chapter 6. The Unraveling. I had tried to leave the house before. I had run, I had screamed, and yet, here I was again. Back in this place that I could neither escape nor understand. The doors I had thought were shut had opened. The walls that once held me in had dissolved, as though the house itself had been watching, waiting for me to come back. I could feel it now, its presence, seeping into the very marrow of my bones, crawling beneath my skin like the chill of death itself. The whispers, once distant, had become more urgent, louder, closer. They were not just words anymore. They were thoughts, my thoughts, distorted and twisted by whatever dark force had taken root in this house. They spoke to me. They clawed at my consciousness, pulling my deepest fears from the recesses of my mind and weaving them into a nightmare that played out in the corners of my vision. The house was alive, but it wasn't just the house. It was everything. The walls, the floors, the air I breathed. It was all part of it. I was part of it now. There was no escaping it. The more I tried to run, the tighter the grip became, like a vice slowly crushing my chest. It wasn't just the scratching, the creaking, or the whispers that had driven me to the edge of madness. It was the sensation that the house knew me, that it had always known me, and that I had always been bound to it, bound to this place, to the evil that lived within it. I had to know. I had to understand. The attic door, the one I had once hesitated to open, was now wide open, as though it had been waiting for me. I could feel the air shift around me as I stood in front of it, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The house seemed to breathe with me, inhaling as I moved closer, exhaling as I opened the door. The hinges groaned, but the sound was muffled, as if something was pressing against them from the other side. The attic was cold, colder than it had ever been before. It wasn't the kind of cold that could be chased away by fire or warmth. It was a deep, unyielding cold, like the chill of the grave. The room was still the same, but there was something different about it. Something had changed. The air hung heavy with the smell of rot, of something old, something forgotten. The mirror. It stood at the far corner where it had been before, but now it seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, as though it were waiting for me to approach. My feet moved of their own accord, drawn to the mirror like a moth to a flame. My pulse quickened, my hands shaking as I reached for it. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. The house had called me here, and I was going to find out why. The mirror's surface rippled, like water disturbed by an unseen hand. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed the glass, the world around me shifted. The reflection was no longer the attic. It was a different room, long and narrow, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch and twist, flickering at the edges of my vision. And there, in the corner of the reflection, was the figure, the woman, the one who had been watching me since the first night I stepped foot in this house. Her hair hung in matted clumps, her face obscured, but her eyes, the eyes that had haunted me, that had burned through the darkness, were wide open, staring back at me. But this time, there was something more in those eyes, a recognition, a knowing. She stepped forward, slowly, as though she were walking out of the shadows, and I couldn't look away. I couldn't tear my gaze from the reflection, even though every instinct screamed at me to run, to turn away from the thing that was about to break through the glass. You shouldn't have come back. Her voice was soft, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it echoed in my head, reverberating through my skull. It wasn't just a voice. It was inside me, tangled with my thoughts, wrapped around my fears, feeding on them. I wanted to scream, but the words stuck in my throat. My hands were frozen, still touching the glass, as if the mirror itself had claimed me, held me in its grasp. And then the figure moved. It wasn't just a reflection. She stepped out of the mirror, her body breaking through the glass like it was made of liquid. The room seemed to bend, twist and fold around her, warping and distorting as she moved toward me. Her eyes were locked onto mine, and I felt her presence like a heavy weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. Her hand, long and clawed, reached for me. "You are part of me," she whispered, her voice a caress against my skin, like cold fingers brushing over my flesh. "You've always been part of me." The words tore through me, unraveling the threads of sanity I had left. I tried to pull away, but the mirror's grip on me was too strong. I couldn't move, couldn't escape. It was as though the very walls of the room were closing in around me, as if the house itself were consuming me. And then I felt it. A sensation, deep in my chest. A pressure, a squeeze, as though something were pulling me inward, drawing me into the very core of the house, into its heart, into the dark, suffocating center. The air was thick, like a fog of darkness that clouded my mind, and I could feel it. The presence that had been whispering to me, the thing that had been waiting for me. It wasn't just in the walls. It wasn't just in the house. It was in me. "You cannot leave," the woman whispered again, her voice now thick with hunger. "You never will." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I could feel my throat closing, the air growing thinner, colder, as though the very atmosphere was being sucked from the room. The shadows began to stretch toward me, thick and solid, like arms reaching from the dark, pulling me closer to the mirror, to the figure. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The pressure in my chest eased. The weight on my mind lifted. The shadows receded. The air, though cold, was breathable again. I blinked, disoriented, and looked around. The attic was empty. The mirror was just a mirror, reflecting only the dim light of the room. There was no figure, no woman, just the empty space before me. But the whispers, the voices, they didn't stop. They were in my head now, louder than ever. "You belong here. You always have." The words were like a drumbeat in my skull, pounding, relentless. And I understood now. The house was not just haunted. It wasn't just a place where spirits roamed, trapped in time. It was alive. It had been alive long before I came here, long before I ever stepped through its door. It was a place of power, a place that fed on the fears of those who dared enter. It had claimed me. I was part of it now. I stumbled backward, my body trembling, but my legs refused to carry me away from the mirror. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to think, as the whispers filled the room, filled my head, filled my very soul. The house was everywhere. It was inside me. It was part of me. "You are mine." The voice was not the woman's anymore. It was deeper, older, ancient. Like the very foundations of the earth itself were speaking, as though the house had a voice, a consciousness of its own. I turned away from the mirror, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I had to leave. But the house wouldn't let me. It wouldn't let me. I made my way to the stairs, my legs shaking beneath me, my mind spinning. But as I reached the top, I saw it. A door. A new door. One I hadn't noticed before. It was old, decrepit, its wood dark and chipped, but it was there, waiting. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to open it. I had to know what was behind it. The door creaked open, and the moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped even further. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the house, like the chill of death itself. The walls were covered in old faded wallpaper, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust that had not been disturbed in years. But it was the air, heavy, suffocating, that caught my attention. And then I saw it, a small chest, sitting in the center of the room. The air around it seemed to vibrate, as though it were alive, as though it had a pulse of its own. I knew what was inside. I felt it. I stepped closer, my hand reaching for the chest. I hesitated for only a moment before lifting the lid. And there, inside, was a small, yellowed journal. I picked it up. "It's yours," the voice whispered. I opened the journal. The first page was blank, but the second was filled with words written in a hand that wasn't my own. "I have been waiting for you." Chapter 6. The unraveling explores the protagonist's descent into madness as they uncover the true nature of the house and its malevolent power. The house itself becomes a living entity, feeding on the protagonist's fear and grief, drawing them further into its grasp. The whispers, the figure, and the mirror all come together to reveal the horrifying truth that the protagonist has been bound to the house all along, and there is no escaping the darkness that waits within. Let me know if you'd like to expand on any specific aspects or further develop the plot. Chapter 7. The Awakening. I don't know what I expected to find when I opened the journal. I thought maybe it would hold some clue, some key to understanding what was happening to me. Perhaps there would be answers, something to explain why I was drawn to this house, why the shadows seemed to breathe around me, why the whispers had become louder, more insistent, more real with each passing day. But what I found inside the pages of that old yellow journal was not an answer. It was a summons. The journal was filled with words, not my own, written in a hurried, frantic scrawl that almost seemed to drip off the pages. The ink was smeared, as if it had been written in the midst of some feverish, relentless urgency, the handwriting shaky and uneven, as though the writer had been pushed by some unseen force. I have been waiting for you. The words were simple, but they were a cold, suffocating promise. I could feel them pressing against me, against my chest, against my breath, as though they were embedded in my very soul. And with every line, every word, the darkness that had lingered at the edges of my thoughts seemed to grow, to pull tighter around me like a noose. I flipped through the pages, each one more horrifying than the last. The journal was not just a record, it was a map of the house, of the land it stood on, of the very space I had been wandering in, unaware. There were sketches, distorted, warped drawings of the rooms I had passed through, the corners I had stood in, and scattered throughout the pages were fragments of symbols, strange sigils that seemed to pulse on the page, as if alive, as if they were calling to me. But it wasn't the sketches or the symbols that terrified me. It was the words. It knows you. It knows what you are. It has always known. The voice, or the presence, I couldn't tell anymore, seemed to be speaking directly to me. It was as though the house itself had taken hold of the journal, written these words through the hand of someone long dead, or perhaps someone who had never truly left. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I turned the page, and my eyes fell upon the next line, the one that shattered everything I thought I knew. You are not the first to fall into its grasp, but you are the last. The last? The words reverberated in my mind, and the meaning of them, the weight of them, crushed my lungs. I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts, and for a moment, everything in the room seemed to go still, as though the air had thickened, as if the house itself had paused, waiting, listening. And then it came. A sound, a low, guttural groan, like the earth itself was waking up from a long, deep slumber. The floorboards beneath me trembled, just the slightest vibration, but enough to make my heart race, to make my body tense with fear. I glanced around, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The walls were moving, or rather, they felt like they were moving. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch toward me, as though they had been waiting, watching, and now they were closing in. I turned toward the stairs, my legs unsteady beneath me, my mind scrambling for a way out. But I knew deep down that there was no escape, not from this house, not from whatever it was that had drawn me here. The house was alive. Its breath, its pulse, its very presence was woven into the air, into the walls, into the very fabric of my being. It had always been there, watching, waiting. As I moved toward the hallway, the sound grew louder. It was no longer just a groan. It was a cacophony, a symphony of voices, the voices of the house, the voices of those who had come before me, those who had fallen under its spell. I could hear them, the whispers, no longer just in my head but around me, in the very air, in the walls, in the floor beneath my feet. The air grew colder again, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. My breath turned to mist in front of me, and the shadows grew deeper, more oppressive. I reached the top of the stairs, my hands trembling as I touched the banister, my mind reeling. my heart beating in my throat. The whispers were everywhere, pressing against me, suffocating me. "You can't leave." The words were not a whisper now. They were a command, a promise. I froze. I felt the walls closing in, felt the very air tightening around me as if the house was alive, as if it were feeding on me, feeding on my fear, on my desperation. My legs felt like lead, and the shadows seemed to move, to shift in the periphery of my vision, drawing closer, circling. I turned toward the attic door, the door that had once seemed like the gateway to my salvation, the door that I had been drawn to, the one I had opened before, only to find it had led me deeper into the darkness. The door was different now. It wasn't just a door. It was a mouth, a gaping, insatiable mouth, waiting to devour me. I reached for the handle, my breath shallow, my hands slick with sweat. The door creaked open with a sound that chilled me to the bone, the hinges groaning in protest, as though the house itself was reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. The darkness beyond the door was thick, suffocating, and as I stepped forward, the air seemed to grow heavier, denser. I felt the pressure in my chest grow with every step I took, as if the house were pressing down on me, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was waiting for me. I had to know the truth. The attic was as I remembered it, cluttered with old furniture draped in sheets, boxes piled high, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. But there was something different now. Something wrong. The mirror. It was there again, at the far corner, standing on its own, its surface glinting faintly in the dim light that filtered through the small window at the far side of the room. But it wasn't just the mirror that disturbed me. It was what was reflected in it. The room, but not the room I was standing in. The reflection was warped, twisted. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, like dark fingers reaching toward the center of the room. The furniture was upside down, the walls buckling and bending as though they were made of paper, as though they were alive. And there, in the corner of the reflection, stood a figure. Not the woman, not the figure that had haunted me, that had followed me through the house. No, this figure was different. It was me. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just distorted, it was wrong. The face staring back at me wasn't mine, not completely. It was twisted, its features stretched, contorted, like something trying to break free of its own skin. My eyes, were black, hollow, empty. And the reflection smiled, a smile that wasn't mine. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my body trembling with an overwhelming sense of dread. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror, from the figure that had taken my place in the reflection. The house, it knew me. It had always known me, and now it was showing me the truth. I was trapped. The house was not just a house. It was a living, breathing thing, a thing that had been here long before me, long before anyone who had stepped through its doors. And it was feeding on fear, feeding on memories, feeding on me. "You are mine." The words echoed through my mind, vibrating in my skull, and I felt the air grow heavy, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. The house itself was closing in on me. The door slammed shut behind me, and I turned to face the figure in the mirror again. It was no longer a reflection. It was real. The figure stepped out of the mirror, its limbs twitching, its face twisted in an expression of malice, of hunger. It wasn't just a part of the house. It was the house. It was the darkness that had been waiting for me, the darkness that had always been there, feeding on the fear of everyone who had ever come before me. And now, it had me. "You can never leave." The figure reached for me, its hands stretching impossibly long, its fingers curling into claws that scraped against the air, pulling me in. And this time, I didn't run. Chapter 7. The awakening plunges the protagonist into the depths of terror as they uncover the horrifying truth about the house's true nature. The whispers, the mirrors, and the figure all lead to the chilling realization that the house is not just haunted. It is alive. The protagonist's descent into madness accelerates as they realize they are trapped, both within the house and within themselves. Let me know if you'd like to expand on any aspects or further develop the story. Chapter 8. The end of the line. The house was not just a house. It had never been just a house. Not in the way that I had believed it to be. Not in the way I had hoped it would be. I had thought that, by opening its doors and stepping inside, I had taken control. That I was simply a man, lost in grief, seeking solace in an old, forgotten place. But I was wrong. The house had always been here before I arrived, and it would remain long after I was gone. It was alive. It breathed. It watched. And it knew me in ways I could not have imagined. Every night, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent, as though they were trying to drown me in their cacophony of voices. I had learned to ignore them, at first, telling myself they were the product of my mind, of my broken heart, the twisted echoes of a soul stretched thin by loss. But now I knew better. They were not in my mind. They were in the walls. They were in the floor. They were inside me. The mirrors, the attic, the figure that had emerged from it. I had once thought I could escape. I had thought I could find a way to leave it all behind, to run from the darkness that seemed to cling to the very air, but I had been wrong. The house had a claim on me, and the more I fought, the tighter its grip became. Every step I took, every corner I turned, it followed me, twisting and distorting my reality until I could no longer tell where the house ended, and I began. I was part of it. The house was part of me. I sat on the cold floor of the attic now, the journal still in my hands, its pages opened before me, each one a tortured confession, a twisted truth, a desperate plea from someone who had been here long before me. The words on the pages had taken root in my mind, and I could hear them now, louder than ever, speaking to me, calling to me. You are not the first. The first what? The first to enter the house, the first to fall under its spell, the first to be consumed by it. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat, as though the house itself had swallowed the sound. I felt it then, the pressure in my chest, the breath I could no longer take, as if the very walls of the house were pressing down on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. I stood up, but my legs trembled beneath me, my vision swimming, my body failing me. The whispers became louder, clearer, more urgent. They were no longer just voices in the walls. They were voices in my head. They were speaking to me now, filling every corner of my mind, twisting my thoughts until I could no longer tell where they ended and where I began. I was drowning in their voices, and the house was drowning with me. It's too late. Too late. Too late for what? I didn't know. I didn't understand. I could feel the fear gripping my chest like an iron vice, squeezing tighter, constricting around my heart until I thought it would stop beating altogether. My breath was shallow, ragged. The darkness in the room seemed to stretch further, to spill out into the corners of my mind, until the whole world seemed to collapse into a void of nothingness. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voices, but even in the darkness behind my eyelids, I could still see it, the reflection, the mirror, the figure. It was there, hovering just beyond the edges of my vision, its shape flickering like a flame in the wind. Its eyes, those dark, empty eyes, burned into mine, and I could feel it, feel the hunger within them. You cannot escape. I tried to speak, but no words came. The house had taken my voice. It had taken everything. I stumbled backward, my feet scraping against the cold, splintered floorboards. But when I turned, I saw it again. The woman. She stood at the end of the hallway, her hair hanging like a dark veil over her face, her arms stretched out toward me, her fingers impossibly long, curling toward me like the claws of a beast. The shadows around her seemed to shift, to twist, and for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw something else, a movement in the dark, something far larger, far more terrible. And then, before I could react, it moved. The woman lunged. I didn't have time to think. My heart pounded in my chest, my body frozen with terror as the woman reached for me, her hands closing in. But as her fingers touched my skin, I felt nothing. No cold, no warmth, just nothing. And then, with a sickening jolt, I was somewhere else. The house. No, it wasn't the house anymore. It was gone. The walls, the rooms, the shadows. They all vanished. dissolving into a swirling vortex of blackness. I was falling, sinking, down into the dark, as though the very floor had opened up beneath me, dragging me into a void. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was weightless, floating in an endless abyss. I reached out, hoping to catch onto something, but there was nothing. The darkness surrounded me, pressing in from all sides, suffocating me, pulling me deeper. And then, from the depths of the darkness, I heard a voice. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't the whispers. It was a voice, her voice whispering my name. But it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command. It was the house itself speaking to me, pulling me closer. Come closer. I wanted to scream, to fight, but I couldn't. The darkness was all-consuming, and her voice, the house's voice, echoed in my mind, louder now, shaking the very ground beneath me. Come closer. You belong to me now. I could feel it then. The walls, the floor, the house, closing in on me. I wasn't falling anymore. I was inside it, swallowed whole by the house, consumed by its darkness. I was no longer just a visitor. I was part of it, part of its history, part of the evil that had lived here for centuries. The ground beneath me shifted, and suddenly I was standing again. But I wasn't in the attic. I wasn't in the house at all. I was in a room, but not a room that I recognized. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. The floor was made of dark wood, slick with age, and the window at the far side of the room was cracked, letting in the faintest slivers of light. But it wasn't the room that caught my attention. It was the figure standing in the center of the room. It was me, or rather, it looked like me. A twisted, contorted version of me, a reflection of myself that was wrong, so wrong. It made my stomach churn. The figure was standing perfectly still, its hands at its sides, its head tilted in a way that made its neck bend at an unnatural angle. Its eyes, my eyes, were black, hollow, empty, staring into the void with an intensity that sent a shiver through my bones. It was me, but not me. The figure spoke. "You're mine now." The words were cold, but they didn't just fill the room. They filled my mind. They wrapped around me, drowning out everything else, until there was nothing left but the voice, the presence, the thing that had claimed me. I tried to move. I tried to scream, to run, but my body didn't obey me. My legs were frozen, my feet glued to the floor. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. And then, as if on command, the reflection smiled. It was a twisted, grotesque smile, stretching its lips far beyond what was natural, showing teeth that were far too long, too sharp, to be human. The figure took a step forward, and my heart stopped. I felt its eyes on me, felt its presence inside me, and I understood. I understood then. The house had always been here, always been a part of me. I wasn't the first. I wouldn't be the last. But I was the final one. You will never leave. The words wrapped around me, suffocating me, and I knew without a doubt that I was trapped. Trapped in the house, trapped in my own reflection, trapped in the darkness that had consumed me, that had always consumed me. And I realized then, there was no escape. Chapter 8. The end of the line dives into the protagonist's complete unraveling, as they come to terms with the horrifying truth that they have become one with the house. The house itself is not just haunted. It is an ancient, living entity, feeding on its inhabitants and trapping them in its never-ending cycle of terror. The protagonist's identity begins to break down as they confront the fact that they are both victim and part of the evil force that holds the house in its grip. The walls close in, and there is no escape. Let me know if you'd like to explore any aspects of the story further. Chapter 9. The breaking point. The house had always been a thing of shadows, of whispers, and of terror that clung to the walls like some sort of suffocating fog. But now, it was more than that. It was alive, alive in a way I couldn't ignore any longer. It had grown, it had fed, and now, it had me. I had tried to fight it, tried to resist, tried to pretend that I could leave, that I could outrun it. But every step I took away from the house, every corner I turned, it followed me. The whispers, the scratching, the figures in the shadows, they followed me into my mind. The house didn't need to have physical walls to hold me anymore. It had wrapped its tendrils around my soul. I no longer knew what was real. The world outside felt distant, like a dream I could barely remember. Everything I thought I understood was slipping away, dissolving into nothingness. My thoughts were fractured, shattered into pieces, and each fragment was filled with images of the house, of the things that had happened here, of the darkness that fed on me. And then, as I wandered the halls of this accursed place once more, something shifted. It wasn't just the house this time. It was me. I felt it, the change. The air felt thicker, heavier, and every breath I took seemed to make the room feel smaller, more suffocating. The walls, which had once seemed merely ancient, now pressed against me, as if they were closing in, as if the house were trying to contain me, trap me, until I was nothing but a part of it, just another shadow in its endless, twisted history. I had been in the house for what felt like days, maybe weeks. Time no longer had meaning, but I hadn't wandered aimlessly. There was a purpose to my steps, a force guiding me through the rooms, through the halls, to places I had never seen before, places that were not in the house when I first arrived. The house was changing. Its rooms had multiplied, its corridors stretched and twisted, bending on themselves like a labyrinth, an endless maze that I couldn't escape from. I had made my way to the cellar. It was a place I had avoided, a place I had never dared enter. The air was heavier here, thick with the stench of mildew and decay. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness, each step taking me farther from the fragile safety of the light above. The darkness in the cellar was unlike any darkness I had ever felt. It wasn't just a lack of light. It was the kind of darkness that had a weight, a presence, as though it were watching me, waiting for me to come closer. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs. The cellar was vast, stretching out in all directions, its corners lost in shadow. The only light came from a single dim bulb hanging from the ceiling, swaying slightly, casting erratic shadows across the walls. But it wasn't the shadows that caught my attention. It was the sound. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching, like something, or someone, was clawing at the floor beneath me. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder with each passing second, closer, more insistent. I stood frozen, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and dread. The scratching stopped, but then came the sound of something else, something more unnatural, a whisper, soft, low, distant, but unmistakable. I could hear it, as if the voice was coming from all around me, the very walls of the cellar breathing, speaking in low tones, words too soft to decipher, but filled with an urgency that made my skin crawl. I took a step forward, then another, my footsteps echoing in the silent cellar. The walls seemed to move, to breathe, as though they were closing in on me. I couldn't escape it, couldn't leave. The house was inside me now, and no matter how hard I tried to run, it would follow. It was in my thoughts, in my dreams, in my blood. I walked deeper into the cellar, following the voice, following the scratching that now seemed to vibrate through the air, through the floor beneath me. My eyes caught sight of something, a door hidden in the far corner of the room, behind a stack of old crates. It was a door I had never seen before, a door that didn't belong in this place, and yet it was there, waiting. I approached it cautiously, my fingers brushing the surface of the wooden door. It was cold, colder than the air around me, as if it had been frozen for centuries. I turned the handle, but it didn't budge. The door was locked, but that didn't matter, not anymore. I could feel it, the presence behind the door. It was waiting for me, like the house was waiting, like the very earth beneath me was waiting for me to open it. I pushed harder, and the door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the walls of the house. The room beyond was pitch black, the darkness so thick I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I stepped inside, the floor cold against my bare feet, and the air was different. It was thick, heavy, like something ancient and evil had been waiting here, trapped until now. And then I saw it, the figure. It was standing at the far end of the room, its back turned toward me, but I could feel it. I could feel its presence, its gaze, even before I saw its face. It was taller than any person I had ever seen, its limbs impossibly long, its body impossibly thin. Its hair hung in thick black strands, obscuring its face. And yet, I knew what it was. The same figure that had been watching me in the mirrors, the same one that had been lurking in the corners of my mind. The one who had always been there, pulling at my thoughts, waiting for me to see it, to acknowledge it. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move. My feet were frozen to the ground, as though the very earth beneath me had come alive, holding me in place. The figure turned. Its face was pale like bone, its eyes hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. Its mouth was a jagged, twisted grin, the lips pulled back to reveal teeth that were too long, too sharp to be human. Its gaze locked onto mine, and I could feel it. It was inside me. The whispers grew louder, the scratching, the breathing. "You are mine now." The words echoed through my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was drowning in its gaze, in its presence. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of its hunger, its darkness. I reached out, desperate to escape, but it was too late. The figure took a step toward me, and I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. I stumbled, my hands reaching for anything to steady myself, but the ground gave way. I fell, crashing into the darkness below, and then the world went silent. The silence was deafening. The air was still. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. But something was there, something in the dark, something that watched. I felt it inside me, and in that moment I understood. I had never left. I had never been free. The house had taken me long before I had set foot in it. It had always been here, always waiting, and now it had claimed me completely. I was part of it, and it was part of me. Chapter 9. The Breaking Point explores the protagonist's full descent into madness as they confront the horrifying truth that they are trapped in the house, bound by its ancient power. The house is not just haunted. It is a living, breathing entity, feeding on its inhabitants, claiming their souls. The protagonist is consumed by their own fear and the malevolent presence within the house, unable to escape its grip. The chapter builds on the idea that the house is a prison, and the protagonist's fate is sealed within its walls. Let me know if you'd like further elaboration or specific developments. Chapter 10. The Final Hour. The house was no longer a place of fear. It was my reality. The walls had collapsed into my mind, the floors had sunk into my soul, and now the shadows were not just in the corners of the room. They were within me. I had ceased to be a visitor in this place. I was its inhabitant, and it, in turn, was now a part of me. The house had taken me. Its hunger, its presence, its very essence had consumed me. There was no escaping it now. There never had been. I had fought it, hadn't I? I had tried to run, to scream, to escape, but all of it had been in vain. Every time I thought I had broken free, every time I thought the house was behind me, it was only a matter of time before it pulled me back. It had been waiting for me. It had always been waiting for someone like me. The house had no beginning. It had no end. It existed outside of time, outside of the rules that governed the world I thought I knew. I had come to understand that it wasn't bound by the limits of space. It stretched through every dimension, through every crack in reality. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, they were all just facades, illusions meant to keep me from seeing the truth. I was inside it now, as much as it was inside me. The attic had become my prison. The journal, with its maddening scribbles, had been the key to unlocking the house's true nature. I knew now what it was, and I knew now what I had become, but the truth had come too late. I had already been claimed. The house had chosen me as it had chosen others before me, and the whispers, those maddening whispers, were no longer just echoes of the past. They were mine. I could hear them now, clearer than ever, like 1,000 voices pressing into my skull. Their words so close that I could feel their breath on my skin. Come. It was not just a word, it was a command, a force that tugged at my very soul, pulling me deeper into the abyss, deeper into the hunger of the house. The walls seemed to bend inward, as though the house itself were closing in on me. The air grew thick, suffocating, and every breath felt like I was drowning. I stumbled to my feet, my body trembling, my hands shaking as I reached for the attic door. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't an escape. It was a path leading me deeper into the heart of the house, into the heart of the nightmare I had become a part of. The door opened with a groan, the hinges protesting as if the house were unwilling to let me go, unwilling to let me escape. Beyond the door was darkness, thick and impenetrable. The kind of darkness that doesn't just obscure your vision. It closes in on you, wraps itself around your thoughts, and begins to erase who you are, bit by bit. The light from the hallway couldn't pierce it, and I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath shallow. The house was waiting for me. It was always waiting for me. I stepped forward into the darkness, my body moving on its own, as though I were no longer in control. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping with every step, until I could see my breath in the air in front of me, the fog of my exhalation swirling in the stillness. And then, as I walked deeper into the unknown, I heard it. The sound that had haunted me from the very beginning. The scratching. The noise that had come from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Now, it was louder, closer. It wasn't just the sound of claws on wood anymore. No, this was something else. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate. It was as though the house itself had a heartbeat, a steady pulse that was growing faster, louder, until it felt like the very foundation of the house was trembling beneath my feet. I pressed on. The room ahead of me came into view. I had been here before. This place, the cellar, was where the house had begun to show its true form. The place where the walls spoke, where the air pressed against me, trying to force the life from my lungs. And now, here I was again, standing at the threshold of a nightmare that was all mine. The walls were different now. They weren't the familiar decaying plaster I remembered. They were alive, shifting and pulsating, the surface undulating like the skin of something otherworldly. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and beneath that, something metallic, something sharp, like the scent of blood. I stepped into the room, my legs weak beneath me, my breath coming in short gasps. The shadows in the corners of the room flickered, like something was moving within them, something too large to be contained. I could feel it now, the presence that had been stalking me, the presence that had been in the walls, in the shadows, in everything. It was here. And then I saw it, the mirror. It stood in the center of the room, larger than I remembered, its surface black and slick, reflecting nothing but the void around it. But as I moved closer, the reflection began to change. The void in the mirror wasn't empty. There was something in it, something that had always been there, watching me. The figure. It wasn't the woman. Not anymore. This was something different, something worse. It was me, but not me. It was a twisted version of myself, with eyes that were nothing but black pits, with skin stretched too tight over its bones, its smile too wide, too jagged to be human. It stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. The reflection of me, no longer just a mirror image, was now alive, stepping through the glass, reaching for me with fingers that were too long, too twisted. I could feel its presence before I even saw it, the air growing thick with its malice, with its hunger. "You're mine." The voice was mine, but it wasn't. It was distorted, warped, like it was being dragged through thick mud, a voice that had been shattered and put back together wrong. I took a step back, my legs weak beneath me, but the figure, my reflection, was faster. It lunged forward, its clawed hand reaching for my throat, its fingers closing around me with an icy grip that seemed to freeze the very blood in my veins. The cold was unbearable. It wasn't just cold. It was death itself, seeping into my bones, stealing the warmth from my body, from my soul. The walls screamed, but not in pain. They screamed in pleasure. The house was alive, and it had me. The figure pulled me forward, its face now inches from mine, its hollow eyes staring deep into me. I could feel it, its hunger, its thirst, its insatiable need to devour me, to consume me, to make me part of it. The whispering grew louder. You belong here. The voice was inside my head, inside my blood, inside the very walls of my mind. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was me. The figure, the house, it was all the same now. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just a part of me. It was the truth I had been running from, the truth I had been denying. The house had already claimed me, and I was nothing more than a fragment of it, a shadow in the dark. I could feel my body start to go cold, my mind slipping, my thoughts unraveling as the figure in the mirror smiled at me, its jagged teeth gleaming in the darkness. The house whispered around me, the walls closing in, the shadows reaching for me. The very air was thick with it, with the presence that had been waiting, lurking in the dark corners of this place. And now it was here, taking me. You are mine, the figure repeated, its voice more solid now, more real. It wasn't just the house, it was everything. I couldn't escape. I couldn't fight. I could feel the walls, the darkness, the hunger closing in. The house had me, and it was going to keep me. Forever. Chapter 10. The final hour is the culmination of the protagonist's descent into the house's grip, where they face the terrifying realization that there is no escape. The figure, once a reflection, has come to life, and the boundaries between the house and the protagonist's own identity have dissolved. The house consumes them, binding them to its dark power, ensuring that they are lost in its depths forever. The line between reality and nightmare has completely blurred, and there is no way back. Let me know if you would like further elaboration or specific developments on any aspects of the chapter.